Hi, thank you for the opportunity to be able to present today and to share more about water and climate in the Navajo Nation. I am honored to be here and invited to be able to speak today. She'e Crystal Tulley-Cordova Yanishya, Twitch evening Nishlan Katnezatni Bushes Chin, Hushk on Hedzoha Edashache, Tuo Heglini Edashanele. I am of the Bitterwater clan, born for the Tangle People clan. My maternal grandfather's clan is the yucca fruit strung on a line, and my paternal grandfather's clan is the water that flows together. It's important to share this understanding of our clan system because it is integral to the work that I do, and my identity is definitely tied to water, and there is a unique relationship with water as an Indigenous person, especially working for the Navajo Nation. A philosophy that we grow up with early on in our life is Tua'e, meaning water is life. And although it's only 3 words in English, it's really more encompassing than that. Everything in our environment as Diné people is really related to the foundation that water provides for all of our environment, including the medicinal plants that we gather, the food that we grow, the wildlife that exists, the saplings in the trees, as well as the domesticated animals that we have as well. This is how the water cycle looks in the Navajo Nation, and what we don't often see are snow-capped mountains or the ocean from where we are located in the southwestern region of the United States. But I think it's important to show this because sometimes when we talk about water, people talk about it like it's not connected and talk about it in a more segregated manner. But as a water manager, it's important for me to be able to share with people, local residents, different policy decision makers, how water is connected, because all of these really are interconnected. For example, evapotranspiration contributes to precipitation, which recharges the perennial streams, the streams that flow year-round, as well as the ephemeral, those that flow intermittently, as well as the natural and the natural lakes, as well as the reservoirs, including springs, as well as groundwater. Here is the Navajo Nation. It has lands in both the Colorado River Basin as well as the Rio Grande Basin. We are over 27,000 square miles. If people think about acres, it's over 17 million acres. And we have land in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. We are the largest land-based tribe as well as the largest populated tribe. And I think it's important to share this map because the Navajo Nation is the largest land base and straddles the upper and the lower Colorado River Basin. I think that's important to consider, especially how the Colorado River Basin is managed. I will now be proceeding to talk about precipitation. It's really important when we think about water and the climate to be able to have an understanding about precipitation. Why is precipitation important? As I alluded to earlier, it's a major recharge source, but also it can have impact on other things like decreased precipitation may also there may be challenges associated with the frequency of dust migration. We have seen that work by Margaret Heiser Red Steer when she was working with the USGS did show that dust migration in the Navajo Nation, particularly in the southwestern region of Navajo. It's also important to have an understanding about that connection as well with plant and animal populations and how it may impact that. In the Navajo Nation, what the Department of Fish and Wildlife has seen is definitely some changes in migration patterns for mule deer, where mule deer are going farther north. So that's important to understand as well, that relationship. Changes in precipitation also impact wildfires, and there can also be change in vegetative cover as well as possible alterations in species composition. So in the Navajo Nation, this work that I'm describing today is really related to work that I did during my PhD at the University of Utah. And it was really evaluating precipitation across the Navajo Nation. There was a paper that was describing precipitation in the Navajo Nation in 2013, excuse me. However, what it was really describing is, an average for the Navajo Nation, but anyone who has driven from north to south or east to west on the Navajo Nation, definitely sees those species composition changes with regard to vegetative cover. And, one doesn't have to be a scientist to make hypotheses that include, there must be changes in precipitation across this region. And so as I did that, I did K-means clustering. These are the regional components that popped out. The northern area, and just keep in mind that the graphs that I show are related to this. So the northern area are represented in black. The graphs will show gray, that will represent the eastern side of Navajo. And then the southern part of Navajo will be represented in turquoise. And then the western part of Navajo will be shown in yellow. And then the high mountain areas will be shown in green. And here's what the precipitation climatology really shows. One, that there's 5 precipitation hydroclimatic regions in the Navajo Nation. And from this map, the x-axis are the months, the y-axis is the average precipitation for all of the water years. And so just really looking at these regions and how they compare to one another. So big things that stick out of all the regions, the driest time of year is June. And out of all the regions, the wettest period for the high mountain areas is during the winter with snow precipitation. This graph also shows that Navajo Nation experiences a bimodal precipitation regime, meaning that it gets precipitation 2 times a year. For the rest of the regions, they see their peak precipitation coming from the North American monsoon. Now proceeding to talk about, the seasonal precipitation. On the left side, what you'll see is winter precipitation on the top graph, and then on the bottom graph will be summer precipitation. The x-axis represents the water years, and just, something to point out is that for the seasonal winter season, what you see is all of the regions really follow the same trend. I mean, and this is related to the precipitation type, really following a large regional area. These are systems that move across the Pacific and move eastward. And that's what this data is showing. And for the summer precipitation, we really have small convective storms with the North American monsoon. So when I was sheep herding, I could be herding sheep in one spot, and maybe 100 feet, even 50 feet from where I was herding sheep, it would be raining and I would be completely dry. So just to describe that, across these regions, it's not seeing the same amount of North American precipitation throughout the whole region. Now proceeding to the right, this graph has the same x-axis in water years. And then the top graph on the right shows the total annual precipitation. And then the bottom graph shows a ratio of, and particularly showing the summer to total annual ratio. And with that being said, you can look at a year. Let's take 2005, for example. And, when we look at the top graph, that was really during that period of time, saw the most precipitation out of the years evaluated. But when we look at that, really, what is contributing to that? Sometimes you hear people say, well, if we have a wet summer, then we're going to have a wet winter. But what this graph describes on the bottom right is that they're independent of one another. Just because you have a wet summer in the Navajo Nation doesn't necessarily mean you'll have a wet winter. And so for that 2005 water year, a lot of that precipitation was really due to winter precipitation. A 1 on the graph really describes that 100% of the precipitation would have been due primarily to summer precipitation. So when we look at the following year, 2006, we see that there's a significant decrease in the total annual precipitation, but the bottom graph really shows that the precipitation contributor to total annual was primarily summer precipitation. And proceeding on, like what are the climate change impacts on water? In the Southwest, there's different evaluations that have been evaluated, but really what we are seeing on the Navajo Nation is indicated on the right side of the graph, and we've seen declines in snowpack. We've seen also declines in more than 30 surface water features. Back in 2000, the summer of 2001, we actually had our second largest reservoir that was completely dry, so that was really interesting. And what we've also seen is worsening water quality in some locations as well. So now I wanted to show like drought classification. And this is using the drought monitor. We have other tools as well that we use in the Navajo Nation, including the Navajo Nation Drought Severity Evaluation Tool, which was a tool developed in collaboration with NASA and the Desert Research Institute. But for this purpose of this description of drought in the Navajo Nation, I'm really using the drought monitor for this. And so this far left picture is really showing June. And if you remember from the research that I had done, June is the driest time of year. And so definitely we're seeing some extreme drought in the area. And so proceeding on to after the summer, so next period of evaluation is really looking at September 27th, 2022. And what we see is has been some relief due to the North American precipitation. And just to give you an example, the North American precipitation season of 2022 was really above average. For example, for the capital of the Navajo Nation in Window Rock, Arizona, we saw 283% of normal. So just to describe, the type of season that we experience with regards to the North American monsoon. And this last graph is from January 31st, 2023. And what we see is, the winter precip events that we've had really have helped alleviate the system and decreasing the severe drought areas as well as the moderate drought areas where it's more abnormally dry instead. And then there's now the existence of not showing drought in the southwestern portion of the Navajo Nation, which is also the region to where it's one of the drier areas. So then it can recover faster because it's an area that doesn't see a lot of precipitation anyway. So now proceeding on to drought impacts, who's vulnerable to drought in the Navajo Nation. And so in the Navajo Nation, domestic water haulers and public drinking water systems are vulnerable to drought, and they are vulnerable in variable ways, including, the impacts to shallow groundwater levels, as well as the quality of water, as well as the effectiveness of supply infrastructure. And in addition to that, we do have farming that is done in the Navajo Nation in different areas throughout the Navajo Nation. We have irrigators along the San Juan River, as well as dryland farmers throughout the Navajo Nation. And this graph really just shows, Navajo Dam, why we're concerned with those reservoir elevation levels. But it's also important to have an understanding, those impacts on water provisions and soil erosion as well. And ranchers are also impacted because there are changes in forage as well as decline in native vegetation. This picture here is my son unloading some hay for a family member to where there's a lot of supplemental feeding using alfalfa. And then the other impact is little to no water in stock ponds. And we also have vulnerabilities in recreation, wildlife, and forestry, just the decreases in reservoirs, the water availability for wildlife, and then also the migration patterns that I alluded to, as well as the increased risk of wildfires. So now just proceeding on to like a bright note of like what we're doing to be able to create a more water secure future in the face of climate change. And we are securing water rights, and an example of that is water rights that we secured in the San Juan River Basin in New Mexico, and this was authorized under Public Law 111-11, which provides an authorization and also more recently, some appropriations to continue with the Gallup Water Supply Project. And the red is the Navajo Gallup Project area. And here are the laterals. So it's an opportunity for us to diversify our water portfolio, now including surface water as well as groundwater, which historically was predominantly, our Navajo communities were predominantly reliant upon groundwater. And so that's what this map shows. And I also wanted to describe, there's been a lot of talk about elevation levels at Lake Mead and Lake Powell, different actions that are being proposed and have taken place to be able to protect elevation levels at Powell and Mead. And I wanted to highlight in the Upper Basin, the drought response operations plan. The framework included the different sections for the participation. 7.2 included the participation of Upper Basin tribes within the working groups. And then 7.3, just outreach and consultation. And this really speaks to changing the way things had historically been done, meaning decisions made and then tribes told later and not really having a chance to be able to make a reaction to decisions that have been proposed, where now there's opportunity to be aware of those proposed decisions before they occur. And so just wanted to end on that note and appreciate the time today to be able to share more about water and the climate in the Navajo Nation.